Good morning, everyone. Thanks for making it out so early. Yeah, I'm here to talk about some work that we've been doing at the Collaborative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences at CU Boulder about cascading natural hazards. And the specific part of that project I'll be talking about is about post-wildfire landslides, and this is sort of a data-driven approach to understanding the differences in precipitation triggers for post-wildfire landslides. I'd like to thank my collaborators, my advisor, Dr. Ben Livna, and Dr. Christy Tampo, and Dr. Balaji Rajagopalan, also from CU. All right. So I'm going to start off by talking about a little bit of background. We're not doing any physical modeling for this part of the project, but I'm going to talk a little bit about why we think post-wildfire landslides are a special kind of thing. And then I'll talk about the data sources and the processing. And then finally, I'm going to be comparing the precipitation between burned and unburned sites using a couple of different methods. I think each of them has something interesting and different to say about these precipitation figures. So I'll first be looking just at the sort of relative precipitation magnitude of these storms, and then secondly, I'll be looking at the frequency of precipitation. So landslides occur when there's both susceptibility and trigger. So what that means here is the susceptibility in this case is something like a recent wildfire, and the fire makes it more likely perhaps that a landslide will happen, but it doesn't actually cause the landslide by itself usually. And so for that, we need a trigger. And so talking about hazard is kind of the probability of a triggering event at the given level of susceptibility. So whatever kind of volume of rainstorm in this case that might be, might change based on the susceptibility. And so the hazard is really the combination of those two things. And I'm sorry, my slide just moved by itself. Okay, but anyway, without both, without the trigger, we don't get the landslide, I guess is the point. And so wildfire increases landslide susceptibility in a couple of different sort of physical ways. So first off, fire destroys vegetation that decreases kind of interception and litter storage, and also releases sediment that's kind of stored behind trunks of vegetation. And because there's no canopy, it increases the raindrop impact force. And in addition, fire can burn off some of the organic matter in soil, which lowers the soil cohesion and decreases infiltration at the same time. And then finally, fire can create kind of a hydrophobic layer near the soil surface, which increases runoff because the water can't infiltrate. And what all three of these things are increasing runoff, and they're increasing sedimentation. And if there's enough of that going on, then that can get to the point where it starts to create a debris flow or perhaps a slope failure. So what we want to know with this project is how do landslide triggering precipitation events change after a fire? So another way of putting that is like what kind of magnitude or frequency of precipitation is required in order to in order to get a landslide after a fire as opposed to in an undisturbed watershed. And so next I'll be talking about the data sources. And so we've picked global databases for landslides and fire and precipitation, and where possible, satellite-based data sources. So the fire and precipitation are derived from satellite data. So first of all, the NASA Global Landslide Catalog is the source of the landslides in this study, and it's useful for studying post-wildfire landslides because it covers just an expansive spatial and temporal domain. This is a little unusual in landslide inventories. They tend to be fairly localized, both spatially and then also temporally, because there will be perhaps one large triggering event that that causes a number of landslides, and then someone will go out and do a survey, but that only tells you about that one snapshot in time. The disadvantage of the NASA Global Landslide Catalog is that the landslides are compiled primarily from news articles, and so that means we get a lot of landslides that are near populated areas in English-speaking countries with plentiful news coverage, and also means that we kind of miss landslides that are caused by a larger natural disaster because the coverage gets eclipsed. Moving on to the fire data, this is the data is derived from the MODIS burned area dataset, which is essentially the date of fire for across the grid. And so like the similar colors in this diagram would indicate a similar fire event, or the same fire event. So then what we do is we just check within the landslide radius for each date if there's been any fire, and add up that fraction of the area that has been burned within the previous 3 years, the 3 years prior to the landslide. And then we classify landslides as post-fire if there was any burned area in there at all in those previous 3 years. And the precipitation is a similar process, but we did a couple of other things in order to try to account for some of the things that we observed happening with just sort of the raw precipitation data. We'll start off with the CHIRPS daily precipitation data set, and then again average the data within the landslide radius, and then we noticed that there were like some of the sites where the landslides were caused by longer storms than a single day, and so what we did for that was to accumulate a 7-day running average that can sort of pull in those longer precipitation events as a single data point. And then finally we tried to normalize the data based off of the location and the time of year, by which I mean like a 30-day window around the event. And so we've pulled from the CHIRPS record, which is about 40 years, and that 30-day window around the landslide day of the year, all of that data, and then calculated the percentile of the precipitation that we actually encountered. And so moving on to the results, I'm going to start out with the precipitation magnitude. So this is the precipitation values that I was talking about in the previous slide, but I have excluded all of the zero precipitation days. And the reason for that is because the magnitudes are normalized by the site and the time of year, but the precipitation frequency is not normalized, and so it was difficult to tell what was really going on with these data with the zeros in there, because there were some persistent differences between the burned sites and the unburned sites. So the day of the landslide is indicated by that big orange arrow, and so this time axis is not like any particular date. It's all relative to when the landslide happened at a particular site. And these box plots are showing the precipitation at all of the landslide sites, but grouped by the fire history. So those red box plots are the burned sites, and the blue box plots are the unburned sites. And the first thing that you can see looking at this plot is that the precipitation is increasing as the landslide approaches. And that's not too surprising, because they're rainfall-triggered landslides. We would expect to see some rain happening. But what we also did was to compare the two distributions, the burned and the unburned, at each day, to see if there was any statistically significant difference. We used a Mann-Whitney test for that. And so looking down at the lower panel, you can see that there's a region around when the landslide happened where there is a sort of consistent, statistically significant difference, and so that is indicating that there's less precipitation at the burned sites, and the implication of that for landslide hazard is that less precipitation magnitude is required in order to trigger a landslide at the burn sites, and that in turn implies that that the burn sites are more susceptible to landslides. Moving on to the second part of the results here with the precipitation frequency. So I've just plotted the precipitation frequency here, and as I mentioned, these aren't normalized by the site. And as a result of that, we see a constant difference in frequency throughout the entire record. Those dotted lines are showing the long-term average. And so that it's a little hard to see what's going on as far as our landslide susceptibility, but it does suggest something about the fires, that they're occurring in perhaps more arid or in kind of flashier climates. But what I've done for this plot is removed that long-term average. And so you can see these curves are much more similar to each other, but also that the red curve is consistently shifted as compared to the blue curve. So it's always to the right, especially in that year of the landslide. And so what that means is that the landslide is occurring earlier in the sort of wet season peak at burned sites. And you can see the red arrow there, which is going to the edge of the peak from the landslide, is shorter than the blue arrow. And this also, we think, means that the burned sites are more susceptible to landslides, because that it doesn't take as much of that wet season precipitation building up soil moisture in order to trigger the landslide. So in conclusion, we found that first of all, there was less precipitation magnitude relative to the typical climate at each of these locations needed to trigger a landslide at burned sites than at unburned sites. And then we also saw that post-fire landslides occur earlier in the wet season than landslides at unburned sites. And both of those conclusions suggest at a broader scale that burned sites are more susceptible to landslides than unburned sites. And finally, we're seeing some, because we're using global data as opposed to much more localized data that is typically used to study landslides, we're seeing that some of the effects of wildfire on landslide hazard are consistent in a variety of places around the globe, which is cool to be able to demonstrate. That I'd be happy to take any questions. This research was funded by a NASA grant about the interaction of mass movements with natural hazards under changing hydrologic conditions.